So welcome everyone to my lecture on a historical perspective of science, spirit and subtle energies. It does cover information from the textbook I was honoured to co-author with Dr. Charles Krebs, chapter 3. However, a lot of what I'll say today goes well beyond that. Some of you here today know me well. Some of you here today know me a little. And some of you here today we've never met. And so it's wonderful to have a diverse audience. Scientists explore the diversity of life and mystics experience the unity. The aim is knowledge, and both groups expend a tremendous amount of effort to reach their goal. Each discipline demands highly sophisticated methods, years of training, and finely honed tools. Requirements of the quest to understand the essential nature of reality. So while science and mystics have different approaches, really what we're trying to do is understand what is reality. And it's just different approaches. So in the early years of human existence, what we often call ancient civilizations, mystics and scientists weren't separate or antagonistic. It was people just trying to understand what is life, what is reality. Now, in the West, these two groups diverged. And today, they are considered mutually exclusive. Science deals with the material world, the world that we perceive with our physical senses, and the realm of spirit has been left to philosophers and the church. So evidence is accumulating, which indicates that actually science and mystical views may actually be coming back together. So actually, since I've left university, in physics, we've actually started to get even more understanding of our universe, and it's becoming more and more like the spiritual perspective, not less, which is interesting because a lot of people think the two things are so mutually exclusive, and yet they're not. So the true spirit of science is Saya. That's where the word comes from, which is to know. And the scientific method actually has much in common with mysticism because both are concerned with understanding our ultimate reality. And both are systems of knowing that have proceeded along different lines, but which seek knowledge of the final truth. So both science and mysticism want to understand our world, want to understand our place in this universe, and what is reality. Both are legitimate pathways to discovering that reality. So for as long as we've got written history, we know that people have sought to understand how the world works. So all cultures across our history in this world, this planet we call Earth, had developed perspectives, which is called a worldview or a paradigm. So early worldviews were largely phenomenological. That is, we experienced it through ourselves, through our senses, and through observing the natural world. They didn't have the machinery and sophisticated tools that we've created in the modern world, but they were still very much exploring this world in trying to understand it and going through very logical processes to find that understanding. So the ancient worldview was that the world was full of forces that caused actions to occur, and pretty much all the ancient cultures believed in a vital force. Now, there's lots of different names that have been given to that, but they believed that there was a force, and energy and force are interrelated concepts, energy has a force attached to it in physics. And so there's this idea that there was some kind of force or energy that created living. Now, why would they believe that? Well, not because they were just primitive superstitious cultures, as sometimes we're led to believe, but because living systems do look very different to non-living systems. And we have a difference in how we function in this world until the day we die. And then we behave like a non-living system and we disintegrate with the elements. So, you know, there is something distinctly different about living systems compared to non-living systems. And we still really, as human beings, haven't put our finger on exactly what that difference is. So this concept that there was a vital energy that innovated, made alive a living thing isn't crazy or silly. It's actually fits with what we observe. And this view of a vital force still persists in pretty much every Indigenous culture throughout the world. They see the energy in the world around them. And that's not because they're not sophisticated, as is often thought of, particularly by the scientific Western perspective. But actually, if we look at the world with an open mind, you do notice that there is a distinct difference between living things and non-living things. So the early Western view was largely from Greek philosophers. So they developed a way of pondering upon the nature of the world and man's place in it. And that area of study was called philosophy. And so they called it natural philosophy when they were exploring the natural world. So philosophers of ancient Greece set the scene for science. So it wasn't called science back then, but it was the precursor to science, and seeing nature as something that could be understood. And of course, we're part of nature, so humans were something that could be understood. They created deductive processes to explore and to evaluate ideas, to decide which ideas were of merit and which ideas didn't fit reality. And so there was this ongoing exploration of life and us in it. By the 1600s, natural philosophy, which came from ancient Greece, was all-encompassing and became church-enshrined worldview. So things started to become what the church told us, started to dominate by that point. But the early Western view was very different to the scientific view held now. So Hippocrates, you may have heard of, the Hippocratic Oath that doctors have in their field actually comes from Hippocrates. He was known as a great healer and philosopher, and he developed the concept of vitalism to its highest form in the ancient world. And the Hippocratic school saw healing arising from natural adaptive powers within the organism, and they called that the physis. So they termed this power, force, energy, physis. And physis was perceived as a healing power or a self-adjusting power within the body. And a quote from Hippocrates, "Though untaught and uninstructed, it does what is proper to preserve a perfect equilibrium." Now, vitalism is very unfavorable in the modern world, and some people have come up with other terms for the same concept. But in actual fact, when we look after our physical body and we provide it with all the things that it needs to function well, i.e. the right nutrients, movement, such as exercise, good sleep, all these elements, when we provide the human body with that, it actually looks after itself. And even a very unhealthy body will start to heal given the right circumstances. So this idea that there is a healing power within is not silly or primitive. It's actually fits with what you notice. So in the early Western view, doctors or physicians were not seen as healing people. They were seen as a supporting role. So rather than violating nature, the physician was seen as aiding in the healing power that was already inherent within the physical body. And there are a lot of cultures that have had a similar perspective. So the concept of an invisible energy that maintains life was very common in ancient cultures, including the Western, which is not always realized. It has had a lot of different names, starting with physis, vital energy, life energy, the French word term élan vital. And it refers to a fundamental property that is essential for life. This non-material energetic vital force seems to provide an energetic template necessary to maintain physiological health. Now, it's really interesting because in biology, they still to this day do not have a comprehensive model for how a living thing goes from being one cell to billions of cells all working together. So that process is called morphogenesis, and that term is applied to an organism growing as well as to the healing process. And we don't have an actual fully explainable model if you just stick with physical things. Yes, we know cells divide and they continue to divide, but how those cells then know what to become, what type of cell to become and where to go, and how they all work together to create this human form or other living forms, is still, there's a missing piece, there's a missing link in that process. Well, how do these cells know? There's lots of hypotheses, but none that has been conclusively proven and adopted. They just tend to gloss over that, well, we don't, that piece of not really knowing how the cells know what type of cell to become and where to go. And the concept of an energetic template actually explains that process very nicely. Now, in the early Western view, they believed that when there was blockages in this vital force, that was the primary cause of ill health. But by about the mid-1800s, modern science had thrown out this whole concept of vital force. I'm going to talk a little bit down the track about why they did that. Now, the early Eastern view was very similar, and their view hasn't changed as much as our Western view has. So they were very intuitive, holistic perspective, and physiological homeostasis, which is a modern Western concept, and we've really only discovered that in about the 1960s in the West. In a lot of these ancient Eastern cultures, they were working with the concept of physiological homeostasis. They just didn't call it that. They had other words for it for thousands of years. Now, we know that both traditional Chinese medicine as well as the yogic system or Hindu, the Indian-based system, which involves Ayurveda and the Chakranadi system, both those systems are over 2,000 years old, and they knew that lifestyle was key to good health. Without the technology we've got today, they were still watching things and experimenting and exploring and noticing what worked and led to good health, and noticing what didn't work and led to ill health. And they were doing very structured observations, and then there were people who could see these non-physical energies, who then would notice and document things. And they were very much going about things with a scientific point of view of exploring the world. You know, it's not that scientists just suddenly came about in the last, 100, 200 years, because we became more sophisticated. People have been following the principles of experimentation and investigation that work for a long time. And so they noticed what led to health and what led to ill health. And they created systems for people to follow to help them be healthy. And even today, we know that lifestyle is by and far the most important element in creating good health. If you make the right choices in your daily lifestyle, your body thrives. So these systems were based on principles that have worked for thousands of years, and they were also based on systems of energy, and that the human has flows of energy. That is a way of looking after the body as well as interacting with the world around us. So although the Eastern view was not as analytical as the Western, it was no less logical, and it was very rule-based and internally consistent. In the East, they saw people as being an integrated being that had both an immaterial aspect, spirit and mind, together with a material manifestation in the physical body. Now, their exact perspectives on that varies from location to location, but they very much have seen this concept of there being an immaterial, a non-physical aspect to the human being. And when there are distortions or blocks in the flows of energy, that leads to ill health. And healing is best accomplished by restoring these flows of energy. Now, modern science actually started in around the 1500s. So prior to that, we're talking ancient Western views. And it was round about the 1500s when it's generally considered the beginnings of modern science. So let's talk about what happened. So they call it the beginning of modernity. That's often talked about in the literature, or the modern era. So in the lead up to this point, this change in worldview, we were going through a period in the West where the church, the Christian church, dominated the views of the West. And anyone who disagreed with the church, things didn't generally work out well for them. So if the interpretation from the Bible was that the earth is the center of the universe, then anyone saying the earth isn't the center of the universe got into a lot of trouble. So we were going through a period where to explore the world and to look at what the evidence showed you could lead to your death or permanent incarceration in some tower. What happened in around the 1500s was there was a separation. They call it the differentiation of the cultural value spheres. Everything was all fused together under the church. And so the morals of the church defined what somebody exploring the world, what we now call science, could and could not do. So this separation of these spheres, science, art, morality is often what it's talked about, but we could say science, art, and spirit. Once they separated them, it actually allowed for scientific investigation to happen in the world without fear of death or retribution. So science was actually set free at this point. So that's a good thing. People could actually now explore the world. without their point of view. Like if the data they collected disagreed with the church's perspective, you were in big trouble. And so from this point onwards, they could do that process of exploring the world without the fear of punishment if what they found didn't agree with the church. So one of the notable figures in this process is Galileo Galilei, often considered the first modern physicist. He actually, through his experiments and mathematics, discovered that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, that actually the Earth revolved around the sun, and he refused to take that claim back. And so he was incarcerated for a long time until this separation of the value spheres happened. And then he, you know, his point of view was accepted and he was allowed to experiment. But what he did was he emphasized testing hypotheses experimentally. So that's the beginning of what we call the experimental method. And it marked the beginning of an empirical approach to studying nature. So rather than thinking things were how they appeared to us through our physical senses, what they started to do was actually to look at, well, what does, when I actually go through a process of collecting data, what do I find? And does that data then fit with our understanding of the world, or do we need to readjust our understanding of the world? And there's a lot to be said for not believing things are just how they appear to us. Another notable figure is René Descartes, who is often talked about in the world of mind-body relations or consciousness studies. So what he did is separate matter, physical stuff, and mind or non-physical stuff. They were just discovering atoms around this time, and so there was a choice that had to be made. Do we go down the pathway of atomic matter, or do we go down the pathway of vitalism? We now know what pathway they chose. Vitalism was given the boot. But so he still asserted that there was this non-physical aspect, which we now call mind in general, and that they're unrelated, like, although they both exist in us as a human, that they were unrelated things, which is one of the big discussions and debates and arguments that happens in consciousness studies around this concept of dualism, that there's two aspects. Well, how do they, and René Descartes' perspective is called Cartesian dualism, which is highly argued against these days. But there was no proof that mind and matter were separate things. There was no proof of these ideas per se, but it was still very much adopted in the academic scientific realms of the Western world. So what happened was that the physical world, matter, was given to science, and science could then go off and explore without fear of, you know, retribution. But the non-material aspects to the world, what we call mind or spirit, was given to the church. And so these two things were separated. So it's important to understand that a choice was made. Now, there is some logic to this separation, because you cannot actually measure non-material stuff through physical machines and physical sensors. We can measure evidence of them, but you can't actually measure them through physical stuff. So there is some logic to this separation, but it's important to understand that people believed in non-physical aspects to this world. They didn't you know, there were those that were materialists even back then, but they weren't the majority. And people did believe that there was matter and spirit. It's just that science didn't take spirit. Science took matter as its exploration. So sciences are by, you know, we call them the physical sciences because what we generally call science is actually physical sciences. They're exploring the physical world. So they are in their wheelhouse in general with what they do and what they report and what they talk about. It's just that they've gone quite far with it now, and they not only do they explore physical stuff, they say that's all there is, you know, because initially it was very much believed, you know, I mean, our world was dominated by the Christian church, and the Christian church believes in spirit and immortal soul that is an important piece of who you are. So it still was very much believed that this spirit existed. It's just that science wasn't going to deal with it. And the problem is that now science denies the spirit exists altogether. So what happened at this time was the scientific revolution, is often how it's talked. So in the 16th and 17th century Europe, natural philosophy, which is what the Greek philosophers were doing, was now transformed into what we know as science. So science emerged with a more mechanistic worldview. It was based on mathematics. If you can't write a mathematical formula for it, it may not exist in a scientist's mind. Although I'm pretty sure most of our daily lives, the meaningful stuff can't be written in a mathematical formula, but anyway. Maths and science very much started off on a pathway at this time, and using the scientific method to explore the world. Now, this is a really interesting thing, because you've got to understand, at this point in the world, actually the church was the dominant institution. And I don't know where everyone sits with regard to Christianity and the church. I apologize if I offend anyone, but actually the church became quite dogmatic, and if you didn't agree with it, you were wrong. And so science was actually against the dominant concept at that point in time. It was like, it represented open-mindedness. It was the new, we will explore the world to find the truth. It was seeking to find the truth and understand this world that we're in, not based on dogmatic principles, but on what we found through open-minded exploration of this world. And so people were actually listening to nature and to the phenomena and to the reality around them in a new way. And it was really actually, it was a revolution. It was a whole new paradigm came in. And so it was about exploring the world authentically, and we want to understand this world rather than being tricked by our physical senses. What does the data and the information we can gather from the world actually tell us? You know, and we found a lot of things that were different to how they appear to our physical senses. You know, we found that the earth is round, we found that the earth goes around the sun, and that there's all these other, we're just one of many galaxies in a much bigger universe. We found that, you know, the world's made up of these tiny things that interact with each other. And so all these things we learned about our physical reality were amazing insights that weren't possible when we were living under a dominant, it must fit with the Bible concept. And so science started out as a whole new way of exploring the world, which was very useful. And we've created so many things that have benefited our world from that process. Now, in the 1600s, there was a scientist / mathematician called Newton. And they say that the scientific revolution culminated in Newton's work. He wrote a mathematical explanation of the universe. If you do physics in high school, you learn Newton's laws of motion and things like that. So he actually wrote this amazing, groundbreaking mathematical formulation of things. He saw the universe as orderly, predictable, yet divine. One of the things I find when you start exploring most of the scientists that have existed in the modern world is it's rare that you actually come across somebody who created profound new insights into the physical world who didn't also believe in some divine spirit aspect to the world. It's quite interesting. Today, it's almost not okay to be a scientist who believes in spirit, but that's a fairly recent thing that has come about in about the last 100 years. Before that, they were all believed in a divine aspect, you know, that something divine created this universe. I mean, where did it come from? The physical stuff must have come from somewhere. I mean, the Big Bang Theory doesn't explain where the stuff came from. It just explains that it all burst out suddenly into the universe, but it doesn't say where it was before that moment. And so, you know, it's interesting that there was, you know, Einstein, Newton, these people believed in spirit, divinity, something along those lines, even though they were scientists, because, you know, it's recently that that's become not okay. It's just that physical sciences aren't meant to explore non-physical things, which is spirit. For its time, the Newtonian model was very advanced. However, what happened was that new things started to be found, such as electricity and magnetism, which are energetic in nature, can't be touched in the same way as matter. And that all started to happen in the 1800s. However, it's really interesting. I think it was Lord Kelvin, a physicist, but I could be remembering the person wrong. But in the very end of the 1800s, something like 1898, 1899, at a worldwide gathering of scientists, he gave a speech and said, well, in physics, we've pretty much sorted everything out. We're now just ironing out the details. And oh my God, could be more wrong if he tried. In actual fact, from 1900 to 1925, the entire physics worldview got completely blown up. So this Newtonian worldview dominated for over 200 years. It was highly successful in explaining what we experience in our everyday world. But quantum mechanics came along in the early 1900s. And from that point on, our world became non-mechanical in orientation. It's not as predictable as we thought it was. It's not this orderly, we can understand it all easily world. So what we found in the early 1900s is that classical mechanics is only an approximation of reality. So the Newtonian worldview only operates in very special circumstances. Now, it just happens so circumstances is what we experience in our everyday world with our physical senses, by and large. So it looked like it was right for a very long time because we didn't have the technology to explore tiny, tiny little things or big, massive things like our universe. So at the beginning of the 20th century, quantum mechanics completely shattered this orderly, mechanical, mathematical view of the world that Newton had brought us. And it's important to understand that quantum physics didn't replace classical physics. That's probably the problem, because classical physics still operates in our everyday world because it works there by and large. But actually, quantum physics encompasses classical physics, and that's just a special case. Now, quantum theory, which started to come into existence in 1901 with certain phenomena that were being found that couldn't be explained by our current maths. And so we had to expand our idea. And between 1901 and 1925, there was a lot of debate and experimentation and exploration. And it was 1925 that a group of physicists came together in the world and sat down and agreed that quantum mechanics was a thing. It was these ideas that quantum mechanics presents were actually highly controversial and rallied against vehemently by scientists because they completely throw on our head this ordered physical world that we thought we had. Now, it's important to understand that as a mathematical theory, quantum theory is literally the most successful mathematical theory humans have ever created. It is amazingly successful. Every time you plug a prediction into it, numbers into it, its predictions are shown to be right in the world. So it is just highly, highly successful. Quantum, the maths involved in quantum theory has transformed our world. It's played a role in the fact that we have computers that can process so fast now, and it's played a role in huge amounts of technology that's been developed in our world. Amazingly successful. And that's why it's been adopted and loved for a mathematical theory. However, it's not the theory and the maths that's ever disputed. It's actually what it says about reality that's highly controversial. And here we are in 2023, almost 100 years since quantum mechanics was accepted on a worldwide scale as a theory to be applied in the world, and we still have no agreement on what the implications of it mean, because it challenges our intuitions about the world. So our common sense physical reality, how things appear to our physical senses in our everyday world, quantum mechanics completely throws that on its head. And it's quite profound that 100 years later, we still can't agree on that. I still find it astounding that it hasn't shifted our everyday worldview that much. You know, the worldview that's demanded by quantum theory is not only stranger than we think, it's stranger than we can think. When you try to summarize the implications of quantum theory, what you get sounds mystical. Now, some people have taken quantum theory and run with it in the spiritual, mystical domain. I try not to do that. I very much think it's still a work in progress, our understanding of how quantum theory applies. But quantum theory denies the existence of a physically real world independent of its observation. So what quantum theory says is that these tiny little particles that make up our world, what we call quantum particles, and you must remember that nobody's ever seen quantum particles, not even with an instrument. We just see evidence of them in the world. These tiny little particles don't exist as a particle, as a piece of matter, until we measure them. So the tiniest little things that make up our physical body, the desk, the chair you're sitting on, everything in our physical world don't exist as a thing. They only exist as a probability. So the theory is actually probability. So rather than things existing as things, they exist as a potential in the world until we measure them. And once we take a measurement, then they exist. But until that moment we take a measurement, we have no idea what they're doing, how they're doing it, or where they're doing it, or if they even exist at all. And that's I remember when I first learned this, I just thought it was so cool. I also learned in particle physics that there's all this antimatter that blinks in and out of existence constantly. And to me, I just thought, well, how could you think the world is just this physically set thing when you learn that nothing exists until we measure it? And so strange quantum phenomena can be directly demonstrated only for small objects. Once we get into bigger stuff, like this everyday world that we interact with, then the effects of it disappear. they're still there. And that is a point that some of us make, while other scientists go, oh yeah, but it doesn't matter because we can ignore them. So most physicists just ignore the implications of quantum mechanics and its strangeness. So, you know, even Einstein, who was pivotal in quantum mechanics becoming a thing in the world, didn't like the strangeness that it implied. And the rest of his career was trying to disprove the strangeness that quantum mechanics brought into the world, and he didn't succeed at that. Nobody has since. They're still trying to get rid of the strangeness, and they still can't. And the reality is even though they ignore the fact that there's this whole does anything exist if we don't measure it concept in quantum mechanics, they try to ignore it. But actually, all the big things like us are made up of these little things that may or may not exist in physical reality. So it really shakes up this physicalist worldview. And I am personally surprised that it hasn't had a bigger impact on our worldview. Quantum mechanics has had a profound impact on our world, but not on our worldview. I find that interesting. Classical physics explains the world quite well. It's just the details it can't handle. And quantum physics handles the details perfectly. It's just the world it can't explain. So it's important to understand that quantum mechanics doesn't prove the existence of spirit or divine creating the physical world or it doesn't prove anything, but it very much opens the door. And they have never, since its creation, they have never been able to close that door again. So they've tried to close the door and go back to just a physical world, and they've failed to do so. So quantum mechanics very much opens the door, because energy and matter are interchangeable in quantum mechanics. Now, when I say energy in quantum mechanics, I'm talking about physical energies like electricity and things. So it shows that they call it complementary. Everything's complementary. Matter and energy are potentially two expressions of the same fundamental thing that makes up our world. However, because we can't find that fundamental thing that they come from, they keep trying to close the door and go, no, only physical stuff, only physical stuff. Now, because of its successes since the 1500s, science became the dominant discourse itself. So remember I said earlier, science was the radical change in the world. It was the minority was, exploring the world through science. The majority just believed what the Bible and the church told them. The minority were scientists exploring the world, wanting to understand it. But over time, science was highly successful in changing our world, as we can see. We're on Zoom having this meeting today because of science finding all these discoveries. So it's been highly successful. So it became the dominant discourse over time. And people began to believe that everything must make rational sense and fit together, that everything could be proved and improved by science. That's kind of become the ideology that now dominates our world. If it's not rational and I can't conduct an experiment, it does not exist. This is this kind of dogma that has now come into our world around science. Science became powerful, and scientists began to believe that only science could understand and explain reality. Everything else was dismissed as unscientific. To be unscientific isn't a bad thing. It means you're looking at the world through a different lens. And we need people looking at the world through multiple lenses if we're ever going to fully understand ourselves. Well, I'm going to get you to the point we're going to understand that we never fully understand reality. But, to explore the world takes multiple lenses. But this idea of being unscientific has now become a label to criticize things, as if science is the only way to explore reality. Unfortunately, the more successful a discourse is in a society, the higher the chance it gets perverted and will move away from truth-telling. So once science became the majority discourse, it then started to be used to manipulate people. You know, there was a time where the church used its concepts to manipulate people. You know, if you don't behave, you're going to hell. So therefore, you must do what I tell you. Don't think for yourself. You must do what I tell you. Well, that's, you know, science was the radicals who were thinking for themselves back then. Now, science has become a dogma itself, and people constantly use science to manipulate. I mean, you know, they use it to manipulate people. They use it to make profit. It's a way to get successful as far as a career is concerned. It's playing this scientific game. And how many times in marketing do you hear? Scientific research shows that. There is an assumption by most people in Western science, and now Western medicine quite often, that there is only material stuff in this world, and that all of reality can be explained by material processes. It's actually an assumption. This is how it's worded. The physical universe is causally closed, is what they say. They're saying that nothing non-physical can ever create change in the physical universe. So even if non-physical exists, it's irrelevant because it can't have any impact on the physical. That is an assumption. It's completely unproven. I went looking for papers on that. There are no papers. And in science, we're not meant to start from assumptions that haven't been proven through some kind of rigorous process. We're not meant to start from assumptions that are unproven. And yet that is exactly what a lot of scientists and medical research starts from, that assumption. They start from an unproven assumption that only physical stuff exists and only physical forces can make an impact on physical stuff. It is a belief system that people have adopted, and you have to question why. If somebody believes that, you have to question why. And if they think it's been proven, they're wrong. It has not been proven. Non-material reality, such as spirit, is not only discarded by modern science, but anyone who believes in it is considered crazy. You get vilified. And the way that people get vilified for being unscientific or believing in these crazy things like non-material reality is similar to what the church was doing in the middle of the last 1,000 years. You know, around the 1500s, the church was vilifying people as heretics if they went against their teachings. And now you go against the teachings of science, you're vilified in the media. And so they've become what science actually set out to work against. It's a really interesting process. So there's this idea that the entire universe machine can be perfectly and rationally understood. And that is why we need experts in society, people who have this rational understanding to lead us. There's this idea that you've got to follow the experts. There are experts who know everything. No, there is not. There is no human on the face of this earth that knows everything. Science is not a collection of facts. Science is theories. And it's just the best theory we have to explain the phenomena we're experiencing in the world right now. Tomorrow, a whole new set of data could appear that throws that theory out and brings a new one in. There is no set reality to the world. There is just our best understanding of it right now. And any theory that has holes in it, like this physicalist one has gaping holes, is incomplete. You know, this idea that there is only physical stuff and we've proven it and anyone who believes otherwise is crazy is a dogma. And it's a dogma we need to move beyond if we're really going to create an awesome world to live in, because actually exploring our world through multiple means is a rational thing to do. So it's now what's happened, and I reckon this is only about the last 100 years, if even that. What's happened in science is they've now thrown out God or spirit or whatever word, divine, whatever word works for you. This non-physical aspect has now been turfed out altogether. Remembering back in the beginning, it wasn't that people said there's only matter. It's that people said that science gets matter, church gets spirit. So this idea that there's only matter is unproven. Yet scientific experts now are considered like they're some sort of all-knowing beings. We've got to turn to the scientists. You know, we've just shifted from one controlling dogma to another controlling dogma. You know, what was meant to be free exploration of the world has become its own new dogma that you have to follow unquestioningly, which I just think the minute somebody says to you that you should believe their point of view or should believe one point of view and you shouldn't think for yourself in any way, that's a scary place to be. And that is actually an unscientific place to be. You know, the modern West is actually the first major civilization in the history of the human race to deny the existence of any non-material reality whatsoever. We're literally living right now in the first time in history where people deny that things beyond matter, physical stuff, exist. Honestly, they always believed that there was a non-material aspect to the world. How they explained it, what they believed has varied. Lots of different points of view, but there was always a belief. This is where I think it gets really cool. We as a human being are constantly confronted with questions. What separates humans from other life forms is not our sophistication and our understanding the world. It's actually the fact that we're constantly confronted by things we can never understand. You know, I mean, animals aren't wondering what's the meaning of life. That is a human conundrum. So we're constantly confronted by these existential things, a lack of knowledge. It's not our knowledge and our understanding that separates us from other life forms. It's actually our lack of knowledge. You know, we will always have questions we can never answer. That is the human condition. You know, what's going to happen to me after I die? Well, we won't know until we die, and then we won't be around to tell anyone, you know. Wondering, do they love me or not? Will I meet someone I can spend my life? Like, we're constantly confronted by questions that science actually cannot answer for us. Nobody can answer for us. So our human existence circles constantly around things that our mind cannot grasp. It's this lack of knowledge that separates us and makes our lives more challenging than the peaceful animals sleeping out in the sun. So this constant uncertainty, which is a fundamental reality for the human, like we are never getting rid of that uncertainty. This constant uncertainty is extremely painful for most people. You know, it's hard to live in a place where there are fundamental, deep, meaningful questions for us that we can never answer. And this fundamental uncertainty can either make you extremely anxious, or you can recognize it as the basis of existence and surrender your need for control. So nobody is certain, and nobody can ever be certain about the answers to these great questions of life. So there's this misconception in the scientific community now that science will answer all the big questions one day, but it won't. We will always have these great uncertainties about life. Now, one of the things that's a pivotal piece in the whole quantum mechanics is this Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says for life is it's not that we're not certain yet. So a lot of people who don't understand this quantum mechanics and the deep profoundness of its implications, think it's just that the uncertainty is temporary, or like, you know, with more research, we will get that certainty. No, what this principle says is it's not that we're not certain yet, it's that we will never be certain. It's impossible to know our universe with 100% certainty. That's what it says. It says we will never know everything with complete certainty. If we know one aspect of reality with certainty, we can't know another aspect with certainty. Like, it actually, from a spiritual perspective, it tells us that our world is inherently uncertain and we can never know or control everything. That's actually fundamentally impossible in our world. And so science remains popular as long as it provides an illusion of certainty for people. So people now look at science as a way to get certainty in an uncertain world. So they see it as their little control mechanism. It's how I can feel safe and secure. I'll trust the science. The science tells me that this is what I should do. Instead of thinking for myself, I'll follow an expert. You know, it's the same thing with the doctor. The doctor tells me this, and I'll follow their wisdom because that provides me with certainty in a fundamentally uncertain world. And so that's the point, is this idea of trusting the science is just a dogma that our society has adopted because it's a way for people to avoid facing this fundamental uncertainty of life. So people have come to believe that science and rationality will allow them to control their reality and reshape the world in such a way that there'll be no more suffering. There's this idea that science will remove suffering from the world, that it'll make us all happy, and we will all dance along to this beautiful scientific world that has solved all our problems. And that's actually not what's happening with science. In fact, every scientific discovery usually creates at least one more, if not more than that, problems. You know, it solves one problem and creates three more. You know, so it's fundamentally impossible to do what people think science is going to do for them. You know, but people want an illusion that there is someone out there who knows everything, and that it'll make this pain of living in a completely uncertain world go away. You know, it's knowing that you don't have complete control of your world and that it's fundamentally uncertain is scary. And it can create a lot of anxiety for people that they're not in control. And so they look to science to provide them with that illusion of everything's okay in the world. You know, there's these people out there who will take all our problems away one day. So rational understanding is extremely limited. You know, like there's this idea, a misnomer, that rational understanding, this scientific process, will explain everything, but actually it's totally unable and will never be able to explain the great mysteries of life. I mean, this is why people turn to spiritual paths, because these great mysteries of life cannot be understood through a rational mind. You actually have to leave your rational mind behind and expand into a more expansive, non-rational space to have any hope of understanding the deeper meaning of life. So the idea was that science is going to set us free, but actually science is doing the opposite. And it's just become another dogma that keeps people trapped and living in an illusion. And it's actually hindering progress now, this dogmatic idea that there's only physical stuff in the world and to explore anything else is crazy, is actually keeping us stuck in a paradigm that isn't making people happier or healthier. So Brené Brown did research, and what she found was that actually people are happier when they live in a state of vulnerability and letting go of control. So The definition of research is to study phenomena for the explicit reason to control and predict. That is what science tells us anyway. My mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. People who let go and are vulnerable out there in the world are happier. So the essence of life is not to be rational. Yes, science is potentially a worthwhile endeavor to explore our world, but we're never going to find the essence of life in it. Because at its core, reality is not rational. When you actually delve down into the math of reality, it tells us that actually life is not predictable. Life is not, the maths actually tells us that it's completely unpredictable. The rational mind is constantly trying to control the world around us. We feel really unsafe because life is inherently uncertain. You know, people don't want to wake up and have no idea about what the world's going to give them that day. People like to feel in control. That is a three-dimensional brain problem. And the idea that we can control the world around us completely is an illusion. And that illusion stops you from connecting with true reality. You know, it might make you feel safe in some ways, but it actually holds you back from experiencing the greater depth of life and the greater meaning of life, because true reality transcends a rational three-dimensional brain. Rationality has become the guiding force in our modern world, but it's not the essence of life. So if you make rationality your fundamental basis of life, then you actually destroy the world, which is what we're doing. We are damaging our natural world in an effort to control everything and to feel controlled and powerful in an inherently uncontrollable world. So people are trying to feel safe and secure. And I guess there's the aspect of wanting to make money as well that's guiding it. But in it, actually, a deep sense of happiness and joy and some semblance of understanding comes when you let go of that rational point of view. Systems theory, which is a type of maths, shows that all complex dynamical systems in nature, which is most phenomena in nature, actually behave irrationally. And it's fascinating that actually when you get to the core, the deepest pieces of the physical sciences, maths, you don't find a rational, controllable world. You find an inherently irrational, dynamical world. And I personally find that interesting and fascinating and much better than a controllable, rational world where every day will look the same. Rational understanding will never capture the essence of life. It's impossible for it to do so because rationality is wanting control and life is inherently uncontrollable. So we need to be humble enough to understand that your human mind will always fall short when you try to grasp the essence of life around you. We're always going to fall short if we try to capture life through rationality alone. If you allow the eternal vibrations of life to move through the gaps in your mind and touch the strings of your being, then you will start to resonate with life all around you. That's the moment when you start to get in touch with the mystery of life. So science is part of an evolutionary process. So anomalies, unexplained oddities crop up in science. You know, there's this idea that science is a bunch of facts, but it's not. Science is theories. They are theories that fit the data the best of any theory we have right now. But by and large, the greatest aspects of life are not explained by science. You know, every day you have these deeply meaningful experiences that can never be replicated. The most joyous, meaningful aspects of life cannot be replicated over and over again. They're inherently momentary experiences that we have, by and large, with other human beings, but it can be on our own. What happens in science is anomalies crop up. So things come up that can't be explained. So the way that quantum mechanics came into the world was there were 3 different experiments that happened across a period of about a decade that couldn't be explained with the current mathematics, which came from Newtonian physics. They couldn't actually explain these 3 different phenomena that were legitimate phenomena in the physical world. And so they had to come up with a new theory that explained them. Now, oddities, anomalies, are generally not liked by scientists who built their entire career on a theory that that anomaly is challenging. And that's the thing you've got to keep in mind. When somebody gets really upset at the idea of non-physical reality playing an important role in the world, that is probably because it challenges some fundamentals of their world. And so for a lot of scientists, healthcare workers, they've staked their career on a particular model. And if that model's wrong, what does that say for them and their career? And their ego is attached to the whole thing. So I have compassion for them, but I also am not happy that they then double down on their theory as it gets challenged. So anomalies present annoying challenges to the established way of thinking. So what happens in science is scientists, rather than accepting the anomaly, they try to eliminate this conflict that has arisen rather than give up their theory. So odd events considered outside what's normal eventually become normal after a satisfactory scientific explanation is developed, as long as that explanation doesn't challenge the current worldview. So this worldview that's become very entrenched over the last about 100 or so years, that there's only physical stuff here, is being vigorously challenged in a number of ways. And my coming lectures will address some of these ways that the physicalist point of view is being challenged. So the beauty of anomalies is they are valuable for inspiring new ways of thinking, but the establishment usually rallies against them. So what tends to happen in science is we go through quiet periods of activity. Everyone's just researching along until we hit a crisis, a point where there are too many anomalies to ignore anymore. And then we go through a transition. And during this transition period, scientific problems appear that cannot be resolved or explained by our current understanding of the world, our current paradigm. Experimental results that can't be explained by the current theories arise. And each new major advance in science starts with an anomaly that it's unacceptable at first. And conventional scientists attempt to explain it within the current framework. And there's usually a smaller group of people who go down an alternative path and are usually highly vilified and argued against. And there's a struggle that ensues. And the crisis is usually resolved by a major dramatic change of perspective, which is called a paradigm shift. So science isn't a nice little linear pathway. It's usually actually great debate and argument and challenge that leads to a major shift in our world. So acceptance of new scientific ideas, it's not usually a nice process, as some scientists might like to believe. Skeptics confidently proclaim the idea is impossible because it violates the laws of science. So that can last for years or centuries. I mean, we're now at 100 years, just over 100 years of quantum mechanics rocking our world, and they still don't want to explore there may be a non-physical reality implied by it. Stage 2, skeptics reluctantly concede the idea is possible. It's possible, but it's not very interesting and it doesn't matter, so let's ignore it. Stage 3, the mainstream realizes the idea is important and that its effects are much stronger and more pervasive than they used to think. And stage 4 is achieved when the same critics who disavowed any interest in the idea begin to proclaim that they thought of it first. They say that science progresses one funeral at a time. The old ideas have to die along with the people who hold them, unfortunately, for the new ones to really rise. But they also say that usually what happens is the original creator of an idea that was vehemently argued against rarely gets credit for it at the end, because you can't say this person who was completely wrong was right. You have to pretend somebody else came up with an idea and it's different. And we'll credit that person with it. So this idea that there's this whole non-physical aspects of reality is not new. In fact, it has existed since the beginning of human beings. That has been a dominant idea, that there is non-physical aspects to our reality. The idea that there is only physical stuff is very new, and it's highly ineffective in explaining many important aspects of our world, including what most of us experience in our everyday life, of being able to experience things through meditation and energy healing and all of that. So, non-physical reality is not a concept held by a bunch of unscientific crazies who don't know what they're talking about. In actual fact, this idea that we need to bring in non-physical aspects to our explanation of our world in science has been driven by highly reputable scientists, biologists, physicists, doctors. They were people who, in the midst of doing their research, very mainstream materialist research, they came across anomalies that couldn't be explained by a physical only model. And rather than going, oh, the data doesn't fit my beliefs, I'll ignore it, or I'll make it fit my beliefs, they went, wow, the data doesn't fit my beliefs. Maybe my beliefs about the world are wrong. And so they started exploring that possibility, and it opened up this whole new amazing world of uncertain, dynamic human reality. So here's my main references. However, most of this comes from listening to people and learning. I did pull things from all these places, but yeah. Okay.